So welcome to our short webinar on navigating the Paris Agreement and the post-2020 landscape. This is sort of the end game for an initiative we've been running for the last 7 months on mobilizing the voluntary carbon markets to drive climate action. A little bit of housekeeping at the beginning. Because it's a big webinar, the chat function is disabled, but you can ask questions through the Q&A function, and we'll answer them in the Q&A function, but we also might, if we have time, take some of those questions live for the panelists. Next slide. So today's agenda, I'm just going to give some brief opening remarks about the initiative we've been running. And then tomorrow, we're going to publish the resulting recommendations. This is obviously an interim step in a much broader conversation about mobilizing the voluntary carbon markets. We're going to be publishing those tomorrow, and the facilitation team are going to be walking us through section by section. And then we have an amazing panel of respondents. We have Chris Leeds from Standard Chartered Bank, Dirk Forrester from IETA, Marissa Buchanan from JPMorgan Chase, and Veronica Elgart from Switzerland. Next. So over the last 7 months, like I said, we've had a steering group that's made up of key components of the voluntary carbon market. So we've had international organizations, the major standard setting bodies, NGOs, civil society, and corporate observers advising on these big questions about how we take forward the voluntary market with integrity, with high quality, and how and whether it docks into the international accounting and transparency processes emerging under the Paris Agreement. We've had 6 meetings of this steering group, many bilateral meetings and emails trying to get to the heart of these issues over the course of the last 7 months. And like I said, we're going to walk through the recommendations that we have today, and they'll be published tomorrow. Next slide. This is just a brief overview of who we've had on our steering group that have suffered through this with us for the last 7 months. We've had some amazing discussions, some very in-depth discussions. And one thing that's really stood out to me is we've had really amazing participation at all of our meetings. So it's obviously a topic that's of great interest to people. And these are questions that people really want to find the answer to. We've been able to do all of this because of the support of the High Tide Foundation. So I'd like to just make sure we give a big thanks to the High Tide Foundation for supporting these amazing discussions and our process. Next slide. Of course, EDF did not at all do this alone. We have this amazing facilitation team. We've been joined partners in crime with ENGIE Impact, Alexia Kelly and Kim Carnahan, who you will know for years from the international negotiations and for their work on carbon markets. Of course, Alex Hanafi, who I work with at EDF, and we have brought on board Alexa Kleistuber as well, who is an independent consultant, but has been in California, has been working on COPs for years, and is most recently with the Chilean COP presidency, and really focused on the Article 6 discussions at the Chilean COP that was in Madrid. Next. So the recommendations, like I said, they'll be published tomorrow. The sort of main areas of substance are the role of carbon credits in robust voluntary climate strategies, quality, which of course is right at the heart of all of the issues we're talking about, the issue of corresponding adjustments, and how and whether they apply to voluntary market transactions, and the really important and fundamental issue of transparency. And with that, I'd like to hand over, next slide, to Kim Carnahan, who I'm sure you all know. Most recently, Kim was the lead negotiator for the US delegation in the COP, and she's joined ENGIE Impact and is moving forward their work on these issues. And we were absolutely delighted to have her help us on this journey and as part of this facilitation team. Kim.
Thanks very much, Kelly. And thanks to all of you at home, I assume, who are joining us today. Just to give you a quick look at the rationale for this process, why we thought this process was necessary in the first place. It starts with companies, and corporate leaders are responding to the climate crisis by taking on increasingly ambitious commitments in increasingly large numbers. So we have almost 1,000 companies committed to science-based targets. We have more than 1,000 companies who have made net zero commitments. 61 of the global Fortune 500 have made net zero, and that leads to over 2.5 billion tons a year in reductions that they need to achieve between now and 2050 or earlier. So it is a lot of action that companies have committed to, but once they kind of step into the box of trying to figure out how to meet these commitments, they realize that it's incredibly challenging. And so offsets allow companies to contribute to meeting the climate challenge immediately, while also putting in place the internal strategies to decarbonize across their operations and across their value chains. So offsets, we see offsets as something to increase the impact of companies' climate commitments sooner, and also to make sure that they can get to the deepest reductions by investing in technologies and implementation strategies that can be put in place over time. Next slide. And just to give you a sense, we do know that companies are increasing their use of offsets. We know from ENGIE Impact because companies come to us to help them do this, but we also know from the numbers. So Ecosystem Marketplace has found that voluntary carbon market activity is rising. The number of companies who are offsetting are increasing, and the volume of transacted offsets is increasing. We really don't think we've seen but the tip of the iceberg for this, however. We expect that offset use will continue to grow exponentially over the next decade, and in a serious way, it's going to be pretty uncertain as well, especially as we start to see the interactions between the compliance offset market and the voluntary offset market emerge in ways that are just kind of hard to currently estimate. But some have estimated that offset demand will actually outstrip supply by 2025. And I think one important thing to note here is that when people talk about offsets, they often mention that the market is oversupplied currently. But what we're seeing, at least within ENGIE Impact, is that companies are not choosing, in many cases, to use offsets, before a certain time period. So that actually takes a lot of offsets out of what they see as the viable supply. If you say you're not going to use offsets pre-2015, for example. So we do see a tightening of the market expected pretty soon. Next slide. And this gets us to our recommendations for how companies should use offsetting in their robust climate strategies. This group had a really intense discussion about the role of offsets. We had a variety of voices within our steering group and among the company observers. And what they were able to agree on is this. Offsets should be used in addition to science-aligned decarbonization strategies, and they should focus on accelerating the scale and the pace of decarbonization. Offsets should also contribute to the most urgent and impactful opportunities to stabilize GHGs soon. So this includes addressing short-lived climate pollutants. Methane is often overlooked, but it's an incredibly important GHG to reduce soon. The protection of existing carbon stocks is also very important. And then we also want to accelerate the adoption of cost-effective low carbon and carbon removal technologies across the economy. We also want to avoid locking in emissions, and we want to make sure that offsets are of the highest quality, and Alexia will get into this a little bit more later. Finally, it's important that offsets that are used be associated with a recognized and credible governance standard that provides transparent and robust processes for all of the steps of offset creation and issuance. Next slide. I think I'm going to pass it now over to another one of our facilitators.
Thanks, Kim. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. This is Alexia Kelly from ENGIE Impact. I'm a director in our Sustainability Solutions group, and thanks to EDF and High Tide for bringing together this amazing process that has been, I think, incredibly instrumental in helping us dig several layers deeper on the intersection of voluntary and emerging regulatory markets under the Paris Agreement. So I'm going to talk briefly about the recommendations that this group came up with around both enhanced transparency and its importance, as well as core quality elements and criteria to ensure that the voluntary carbon markets are delivering the environmental outcomes that we know are so necessary. So overall, transparency is going to be a key bedrock of this market. I'm sure that goes without saying, but there's certainly significant opportunity to enhance the level and degree of transparency across this system, particularly in this transition period, as the Paris Agreement implementation really ramps up and as countries get more formal and more clear around what their nationally determined contribution implementation trajectory looks like. So working to accelerate and enhance standardized reporting systems for tracking progress in both the public and private sectors. So corporate, if you've ever looked at a corporate sustainability report, they're often pretty light on detail. So one of the things that this group thought would be particularly useful was in having those companies be clearer about how they're meeting their voluntary climate change commitments and the various types of credits, where those credits are coming from, the vintages of those credits, and the standards that those credits are associated with, just to help us really understand at a much more granular level the role that the voluntary markets in different geographies and project types are playing in supporting corporations in achieving their emission reduction objectives. There was also a recommendation to explore development of a central data repository that would enable us to more clearly and transparently get a global view of international emissions flows in the voluntary market specifically. Next slide. So in addition to the very robust set of information that's already made public, and it's, while we've had sort of fits and starts in many regulatory markets internationally, the voluntary market has been charging full steam ahead for about 15 years now, developing what is a global and quite robust set of reporting and information tracking and transparency systems. So there was a general recognition of the importance of building on that. To explore opportunities for standardizing reporting across those systems, to look at ways to improve access to the information that already sits in the voluntary registries, and to look at ways in which we can do a better job of reflecting and evaluating non-GHG impacts of these projects, which we know are so important in many of the places that the projects are being implemented. Also a call for extending public consultation periods and undertaking enhanced review of comments and inputs to the standard setting process, and overall ensuring that adequate information is made publicly available to really help us understand and dig deeper, particularly around the core issue of additionality and other quality elements, which I'll talk more about in just a moment. Next slide, please. So for any of you who've worked on offset markets, quality is just one of the most challenging and also fundamental elements of this market. So overall, a reassertion of the incredible importance of ensuring that any carbon credits that are used are resulting in additional measurable and verifiable reductions, avoidance, or removals of greenhouse gas emissions. And that we're sourcing them from programs that have measures in place to address both leakage and non-permanence. This concept of additionality will continue to be core, so whatever we're investing in the voluntary market needs to be driving abatement that would not have otherwise occurred, and we'll need to continue to iterate and refine on those core pieces. And then also look at opportunities to make sure that credits are associated with a recognized and credibly governed standard. So we don't want to go back to the days of the Wild West when there really was no regulation. How do we build on the systems and infrastructure that are already in place? And then continued recognition of the importance of environmental and social safeguards, and making sure that, again, as we're developing and refining these methodologies, that we have regular review and opportunities for engagement from the public throughout. Next slide. So as NDCs continue to be implemented and as countries' plans vis-a-vis the implementation of their NDCs become clearer, the voluntary market is going to need to respond. And so we anticipate that these markets will continue to intersect to greater and greater degree. But one of the important, I think, refinements and understanding that came out of this process was a recognition that just because an NDC, a country has an NDC, does not automatically disqualify voluntary market activity in that country. That we're really going to have to go one level deeper and look at the key policies and regulations that have been put in place in order to drive legal reductions, legally obligated reductions in a particular market, and that we're going to need to get a lot more nuanced on how we set baselines vis-a-vis emerging implementation frameworks under the Paris Agreement. Also look at, and we're going to need to think more deeply about the interaction of crediting periods and NDC progression. So the NDCs are obviously on a 5-year cycle of what is hopefully increasing ambition over time. We're going to need to be looking at how crediting periods in the voluntary market and crediting period, or not crediting, commitment periods for nationally determined contributions and their implementation, how those two things intersect and begin to play against one another. And then the last point is really looking at host country engagement as a critical element of thinking through and feeling our way through this transition period and towards a system that drives enhanced ambition and continued support for the critical financing needs of host countries in the voluntary markets overall. So there's a lot more work to be done across the board here, but Alexa's going to provide a few more insights into specifically the role of corresponding adjustments that are obviously closely related to implementation of NDCs and international transfer flows as we move through this transition period and into what is hopefully a more integrated and robust intersection of voluntary and regulatory markets moving forward. Alexa, over to you.
Thanks, Alexia, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I see a lot of familiar names on the list here, but also some new ones as well. So that's always really great. Sad I can't see your faces, but really good to have some new names too here. So I'm going to give an overview of our recommendations on corresponding adjustment. This was a foreign word and world for many of our steering committee members and in general. So we spent a lot of time in the process actually developing a shared understanding of what it is and why it's relevant to voluntary carbon markets. I think first and foremost, we needed an understanding of why it's important. And of course, under Paris, double counting of ITMOs is used towards NDCs and other international purposes, which we kind of understand code word for CORSIA, is to be avoided on the basis of a corresponding adjustment. So it's really a system of double entry bookkeeping for accounting. If I sell it, I add it back to my inventory, and if I buy it, I can subtract it from my inventory. So the whole point here is only one country gets to benefit or count those emissions reductions. And so kind of with that context, the purpose is to ensure that mitigation is not counted more than once toward the achievement of an NDC, which is very, very relevant. Another important point that everybody recognized is that some of these rules, some of the Paris rules are agreed. The concept of corresponding adjustment, of course, is agreed, and some of the initial rules, but the full infrastructure is not yet agreed or implemented. So corresponding adjustment credits are not actually ready and available, and this, of course, affected the discussions and affects the recommendations that we're presenting to you today. It's also important to note that corresponding adjustment is not just a country level accounting system. It also, Paris also ensures that, it also says that these international rules need to apply to avoid double counting when airlines, for example, use carbon credits to comply with CORSIA. So really the kind of also headline that everyone recognized and affected these recommendations is that Paris doesn't really directly address the interaction between and among the voluntary and compliance markets, and that international rules won't apply unless a country really chooses to implement them themselves on their voluntary market, or a buyer really chooses to demand it and look for it and go out and actively find it, which is, very applicable to some of the concepts that Alexia was mentioning on host party engagement. So with that context, I'll turn to the recommendations and just really note that for us and for the steering committee, this was really an issue of threading the needle or walking a very fine line. Both of those analogies were used over and over again. And because really what we are, we're trying to really navigate this post 2020 landscape of the Paris Agreement, but also the need to mobilize action and continue investment. We certainly don't want to hamper anything that's going on and the much needed reductions that will be, the scale and speed at which we'll need to enhance if we are to meet the temperature goals of Paris, meet all the net zero goals that are popping up, as Kim mentioned, with companies, but also with countries. And also just the fact, of course, to maintain environmental integrity and have a system of accounting and to avoid double counting in the world, just across the world. So this is how we begin to walk the fine line here, as you'll see. It kind of involves 3 specific stages. The first 2 are shown here, but the first really is just the fact of here and now that we need urgent action and it should not be delayed. So while we are in this period where we don't have all the rules of Paris agreed and we don't have the infrastructure fully built out, we don't know what that looks like. We are urging companies and market participants, standard setting bodies to really continue their work investing in these carbon credits, continue to support these robust activities that reduce emissions and enhance removals. And in order, of course, to facilitate countries achieving their nationally determined contributions. That's the here and now. Then we also recognize, together with the steering committee, that there is this transition period. We are in it, and we will continue to be in this transition period, probably for a year and many years to come. So with that said, we have work to do in the transition period. While we're here, we need standard setting bodies, project participants, companies, international organizations, and civil society, everybody really to work together with governments to ensure systems are put in place so that we can have this eventual full and robust accounting and that they don't create a barrier to more investment. So we're working on this infrastructure together, and we're looking at emerging international guidance that will come out of the negotiations and many other groups that are working to tackle this issue. And so that takes us, next slide please, to a kind of a third period and looking towards the kind of mid to long term, where we really see that further alignment and continuous improvement is necessary over time because we don't have all the rules in place and the infrastructure. We need to kind of keep working while we, while things progress in that direction. I think what's important here is that where it will advance the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So again, that's our temperature goals, the net zero around mid-century, countries meeting their NDCs, all of that, having and avoiding double counting, with the objective of all of that happening. And once the systems are in place, then all of these market actors that we've outlined here should invest in voluntary credits associated with corresponding adjustment in line with relevant international guidance. And also, just utilize that infrastructure once we have it, which Alexia discussed, and is very clear here that we just need to see how that develops over time. And then lastly there, the point is, I think that came up a lot, is really host party engagement. And as we know, the host party is the one where the project is really originating. There needs to be kind of this new era of cooperation and communication, transparency, and even trust built between these two markets, between the actors in the voluntary market and the world of NDCs and the world of Paris, to really understand what the countries are doing, what they want to do, where their reductions are available, where they want investment, and where it can really help meet their goals of their NDCs. And so we continue to work with these governments to improve that engagement and the robustness, fairness, and efficiency of the systems. And then just lastly, very quick as kind of a side, but also tying into what Alexia said, is that clarity and review are essential, and that we recognize that things are evolving, and we recommend good practice and processes should be reviewed regularly. We should look at international guidance, mitigation strategies, NDCs, and of the implementation of how things are going, and really kind of reevaluate along the way. As we know, some NDCs are 5 years, some are 10 years. So we'll have a lot of work to do over time as we better understand what countries are doing and how they're doing it, and how these two worlds intersect. So with that, again, I'll just emphasize it was a fine line, and thank you so much to our steering committee members for kind of making it work in the end and really making sure that we got the balance right, we hope. And we'll see where things evolve, and we hope that these recommendations are a helpful first step. And with that, I'll turn back to you, Kelly.
Thanks, everybody. Next slide, please. Thanks, everybody, and thanks so much for the great questions that are coming up in the Q&A function. I mean, I think some of those questions are just right on some of the biggest issues. So I think everybody's thinking in the same direction. As I said, these recommendations are a first step. There are more answers to be found, and one of the things I would highlight is that the consistency of the participation and the level of discussion we were able to have in this group really shows that there's a desire to get it right, that people really want to get this right, and that's great. But in terms of future work, we still need to do some more thinking about the interaction between the accounting systems for companies and countries. You know, how they nest into one another, how they dock together, and the issue of claims, who claims what, and how that all fits together towards greater ambition and high integrity use of the voluntary carbon market. I think there's also a lot of questions about, you know, the scope 1 and 2 versus scope 3 claims, and how all of that fits together in terms of a company's accounting. So those are issues we're going to look at further. The analysis of the impact on supply, demand, and price of the application of corresponding adjustment, and this continuum between the importance of the investment and enhanced global ambition as we go along. So we'd really like to get some more data, some more actual numeric analysis behind that to see what the impacts of these things are, because right now, a lot of the discussions have been at a principled level, and we would really like to look into the numeric impacts. The impact of NDC implementation and progression on additionality assessment, baseline determination, and materiality thresholds. That's a huge area, but as we see more and more policy enacted to implement NDCs, there's going to be an impact on, you know, what is additional, on the length of the crediting period and how all that fits together. And on how baseline should be determined and or revised over time to take account of this post-2020 context, where we have to see more and more policy put in place to implement NDCs. Approaches to enhance host country engagement, that can be quite complex, and we have to make sure that it's fair and efficient and isn't in itself a barrier to investment. And then finally, the establishment of any kind of central data repositories or centralized accounting and transparency pieces that can facilitate all of this, because we heard more and more in the discussions that transparency is really key. But I don't want to focus any more on this. I do want to hand over to our panel. Keep the good questions coming. So we have an amazing panel today. We have Chris Leeds, who's the Executive Director of Commodity Organization at Standard Chartered Bank. And he is a member of Mark Carney's Taskforce on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. And we have Dirk Forrester, who's the CEO and President of the International Emissions Trading Association. Veronica Elgert, who's the Deputy Head of Section at the Federal Office of Environment in Switzerland. And Marissa Buchanan, who's the Managing Director and Head of Sustainability at JPMorgan Chase. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. Dirk, you have been with us through these 7 months discussing these issues. I wonder, from your perspective, how live is this conversation? How much are your members talking about it, and how much are you facing these kind of issues when you're sort of out in the world doing what you do?
Well, so we don't get to go out in the world anymore, but from my perch in my desk in South Alabama, it's certainly a topic that's getting a huge amount of attention. And I think it's driven in part by the investor interests. So what Chris and Marissa have to say, I'm sure will enlighten that a bit. But I also think that it's driven by companies that are truly coming to grips with what it means to be net zero. Our own organization published a document, our board did earlier in the year, on sort of what net zero means, you know, as companies prepare for operations out into the future. And increasingly the role of not just international trading, but also the role of removals and nature-based removals and technological removals comes to the fore. So I guess our ultimate vision is that a lot of the infrastructure that we're talking about building here, whether it be for voluntary markets or compliance markets, needs to be able to support investments at scale that are driving toward net zero. So I guess that underscores that the topic is hugely important. I also think that the world of Article 6, that we are struggling here because of the inability of negotiators to get solutions on this. And I truly hope that a year from now, we're looking back on a Glasgow COP that's been successful in clarifying how this should work. But where I thought the real contribution of this task force is in beginning to think about that as a transition, because I know the frustration of a lot of current voluntary market practitioners within my organization and within CROA, which is also part of IETA, is that you can't just go out there and do a corresponding adjustment as a private business. It's something that requires government action, and certainly creating conditions for that to happen in a quality way and in a transparent way, and one that everybody knows what the rules are. That's where we want to go. But you can't go out and do that immediately. Veronica's here and she can talk about the Swiss government's terrific pioneering work on this, but it's still not a correspondingly adjusted unit until that act has been done. But what I think is helpful, that I think came out of these discussions, is that Article 6 is not just corresponding adjustment. There's a lot more to quality in Article 6 than just that one act that takes place. There are authorizations for units to be exported that matter under 6.3. There are assurances that units are surplus under 6.5. There are tracking systems to ensure that units aren't issued more than twice or used more than twice. And all of those are things that voluntary markets can embrace and can help with much sooner than the corresponding adjustment, which, you know, for those that are following it closely know that may be an event that takes place every, you know, at the end of periods as opposed to on a routine basis, although for some it could happen on an annual basis, and we'll encourage that. But I guess I feel like voluntary markets will be able to grapple with this over time. I think there was also a lot of discussion about the potential of standards and registries to label units so that buyers can understand if they're getting units that are getting closer and closer to that corresponding adjustment or not. And I think that would be a terrific breakthrough. And then ultimately, I think we certainly see a lot of interest in how registries might come together in meta registries that can provide more transparency, better you know, assurance of quality on at least the data front, that things aren't happening, you know, units aren't getting issued in multiple registries or anything like that. A meta registry could certainly be helpful. But I guess just to summarize, I think terrific piece of work in threading the needles here and giving some guidance, but just highlighting it is really important work to get this right. And it's important that we understand that we are in a transition, so we can embrace that and understand that we will be able to consistently get better over time. I'll stop there and look forward to the exchange later on, but thank you.
Thanks, Dirk. And I do think the notion of a transition is really important and one that we've really leaned into. You mentioned the need and cooperation of government. So I think I will pick on you next, Veronica, because the Swiss government have been thinking a lot about this, maybe more than a lot of others. So it would be great to hear what you guys have been thinking and how you're arranging your bilateral agreements around these issues.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to this discussion. There's certainly a lot for us to learn as well in this. We as the Swiss government certainly are on the spot on many of these raised questions and recommendations. This is twofold, because on one side, Switzerland will be purchasing and using ITMOs for our climate target, which clearly requires corresponding adjustment. In our setup, we need to enable private actors to purchase such ITMOs on the market. So there goes a challenge for the Swiss government how to handle this in the transition period. And even more so for the Swiss government, as we have also voluntary climate targets beyond our Paris target, that we also partly will use offsets to achieve, for example, for flights of the federal administration. So there we're faced exactly with the same questions as the government, as any actor in the voluntary carbon market, whether we will require corresponding adjustment regarding this target or not. So I'm happy to reflect on some of the reflections from the Swiss government side. Certainly to take this first, the Swiss Federal Council has already stated its intention to use credits, including corresponding adjustment, also for our voluntary target. And let me elaborate on our reflections here and how we foresee to do so. Clearly from our perspective, and I guess it's well known, the Paris Agreement marks a paradigm shift in the international regime. Now each and every country has a climate target, and this has implications for voluntary climate targets as well as for the targets of the Paris Agreement. Simply by the fact that from now on there's a new quality of credits on the market, or shortly will be, and those are credits that include corresponding adjustment. These credits, what differs them from what we know until now, they represent mitigation action beyond the targets of the parties to the Paris Agreement, of course, notably from where they are achieved of the host countries of these mitigation outcomes. Now, for different purposes, a different choice may be the right one, whether to require corresponding adjustment or not. We, as the government, certainly appreciate that all of the carbon markets and all credits stipulate climate action, and this is very helpful in the move towards net zero. This is very clear to us. In our own case, the Federal Council foresees to address double counting between the voluntary target of Switzerland and the Paris Agreement targets, because we are claiming climate neutrality in this voluntary target, and therefore consider necessarily to require corresponding adjustment. Now, with this background, Switzerland is on the spot and has moved forward in implementing Article 6. We have recently signed two first bilateral treaties with Peru and Ghana to cooperate and to transfer mitigation outcomes. These agreements clearly define that the ITMOs may be used for the achievement of the Paris Agreement targets, as well as for any voluntary mitigation target of private or public entities. Switzerland will do so for its own voluntary target, as I said before, and actually under our agreement, any private or subnational stakeholder can apply for authorization for its engagement, and thereby we offer a means how to ensure avoidance of double counting and include corresponding adjustment in transferred units if authorized under our agreements. We hope this will help advance the carbon markets and bring opportunities also in the intersection between the compliance and voluntary markets, and to find each and every stakeholder the right way to move forward. We certainly appreciate very much the reflections on the transition period. It's very clear that we will not move from today to tomorrow, that there will be sufficient, even just credits on the market, including corresponding adjustment. That is very clear. We need to build this up, all of us in all our national contexts. So this is a reflection that resonates a lot with us. At the same time, we have learned in our journey that if there's a lot of will, there is also a way. And under our agreements, actually, they offer a channel to acquire and engage in transfers, including corresponding adjustment from 2021. So with this, a bit of ambition along the way, we hope to advance the carbon markets, and very much looking forward to hearing from your initiative and learning for our own engagement.
Thanks very much, Veronica. I mean, I think we focus a lot in the discussions on the issue of corresponding adjustment and how these accounting systems talk together. But of course, quality more generally is also a really important topic and something we spent time on. And Marissa, you weren't involved in the entire initiative, but you were there for the good parts. And I know quality is something you guys have thought a lot about, and we've had bilateral conversations on it. So how does that play into all this, and how much should be offset and used from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. And first, I want to thank EDF, High Tide, and ENGIE for convening this work. It's really, really important. And this work on offsets has been going on for the better part of 2 decades. We have a lot of good learning and knowledge to lean upon. And I think it's great that there is attention kicking back up to the offsets market again, given the extent to which I think we're all going to need offsets as part of both any market-based compliance program to address climate change, as well as for the voluntary market. And the work that you all have done is really important to us at JPMorgan for 2 reasons. One is we have our own commitments around carbon neutrality. So that means we do purchase offsets to offset all of our scope 3 emissions from air travel. And we are now going to be purchasing offsets to help offset some of our scope 1 emissions from the operation of our buildings, branches, and data centers. And, that goes above and beyond what we're doing to go out and purchase renewable energy, given that electricity use is the biggest part of our direct operational footprint. So I think, in terms of sequence, the idea, and I think your report underscores this, take the efforts that you can to reduce emissions internally first before you begin to look outside the fence line. The other reason why this work is so important to us is because we have so many clients now that are really increasing their own voluntary commitments to reduce emissions. And, we know that, offsets are going to play a critical role in the ability of companies to meet their strategies. And, we know the only way that these commitments really work is if, the offsets that are being developed and that companies can purchase are of high quality, and, really making sure that we have high quality additional offsets is really the foundation of, any program being successful, whether it is a compliance-based program or a voluntary program. So I think, I liken it, to Kelly, coming back to the basics, focusing on additionality. That is certainly going to require ongoing public and private cooperation, especially as regulations and policies evolve. We're going to have to make sure that offset protocols are adapted accordingly so that they are always up to date and reflect the best knowledge and information and practices out there. And again, I think really finding ways to cooperate on the development of a robust infrastructure for verification of credits, transparency, tracking of information, making that information publicly available. I will say, I think the voluntary offset market has a lot of great work that it can lean upon that already exists. And for me, it's not so much about sort of reinventing the wheel, but thinking about continuous improvement. How do we continue to build on the good work that has already been done so that, in years forward, offset programs can continue to remain a high quality source of reductions for companies, for both, compliance-based means as well as voluntary means. So, really glad to see all the work that's been done here. and look forward to working with you and others to operationalize these recommendations going forward.
Thanks so much, Marissa, and the process was certainly better with your involvement. So thanks for considering these issues so carefully and thoughtfully. And Chris Leeds, I'd like to hand over to you because there is this intersection. I mean, obviously you have years of experience in the carbon market as well, but maybe specifically, there's been a lot of interest in the Mark Carney Taskforce on voluntary carbon markets, and the intersection of initiatives like this and what's going on in the Mark Carney initiative. Maybe speak to that. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Kelly, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be able to address you all. And as you say, it's interesting because I think that many of the people on this call are intimately involved with what's going on with the TSVCM, with Mark Carney's initiative. They're also involved in other initiatives, and I saw, obviously Guy Turner's on the call, and Trove is working on an initiative which is going to look at corresponding adjustments and other areas with that intersection between the voluntary and the compliance markets. And that's an important part to look at. One, because we're not looking at it, well, we haven't looked at it too closely in the task force, yes, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But it also, it's an area that, as we've already seen today, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on it, and it would be great to have further focus on those areas. And as well as Dirk said, Article 6 isn't just about CAs. There are other angles to it as well. And I think what's great is that the work that the task force has done is it's not in isolation. It's working with many other groups, as I say, many people on this call, many people in some of the other initiatives that are going on, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. We're trying to bring things together as much as possible. This is not about working against people. This is not about competing. This is not about being the best or the first. But so it's really important that we do continue that cooperation, and it's great to see. I think we are very pleased that we've managed to do the work that we have done in a fairly short period of time, from beginning of September to the 10th of November, when we actually published the consultation. Now, it does help when you've got an international consultancy throwing all of their resources at it. So it does have an awful lot to do with it, whereas initiatives like this, it is very much, we're on our own. We're having to do everything ourselves. We're not getting, that resource. So it does help an awful lot, and that's, that's something that we know we're very lucky to have. But we're now to the point where the consultation finished last week on the 10th, and we're going through the details of that at the moment. Now, we had 162 responses to the consultation, plus a number of written responses. So many people responded directly to the consultation itself, but then we had a series of written ones from the likes of IETA, I think EDF. There were a number of written responses with great detail, and it's been fantastic. And what I love is the fact that 9 times out of 10, probably more so, that the responses have been positive and constructive. They may be critical, and there's lots of areas where the report can be improved, but they're very much constructive. And I think that even where the responses are against what we're saying, or not against, that's not the right word, but have criticised some of the areas. There are also areas where they're looking for solutions, and actually where we're able to come back with solutions. So, for example, 73% actually said that they would endorse the report, 27% said they would not. But those many of those responses were conditional. So if certain things change, then they would be able to endorse. The 73% who said they could endorse, that was it. They're happy with it as it is. So that's without conditions. So that's really positive. Of course, we've obviously looked at the areas around things like nature-based solutions. There's controversy around that, but again, it's an area that we're making progress on. The vintages is another area, and overall, you know, it's around this governance angle. And I think we've seen a few questions today around what could be done around governance. And the task force has no remit to impose governance. It's a voluntary market, so by its nature, we cannot impose anything. We can't expect anybody to do anything. But like all markets, and you know, if you look at any market around the world, the regulation is typically or markets are self-regulated, and then regulation is brought in on top of them as is needed. But law and you know, international contract law will determine most of the regulations per se. But I think there will be an element of new structures put in place, but hopefully over the top of some structures that already exist to bolster them, to help support them and help this market grow. Nobody's trying to reinvent this market, far from it. It doesn't need reinvention. There's been some fantastic progress made over the years, and we just want to support that, to scale it and to make it better as much as possible. So one of the areas that we didn't really look at, as I mentioned earlier, was around corresponding adjustments and around that interaction, that intersection between voluntary and compliance markets. It is pretty clear from the responses to the consultation that we will need to do some more work on this, and it's an area that that needs to be thought about very carefully. But what I will say is that the task force will go on beyond the 27th of January, when the report will be, the final report will be published. It will be republished with a implementation roadmap that will look at many of these areas, specifically around governance, around the core carbon principles, around market integrity principles, legal and accounting issues, being able to develop demand and supply commitments, how we manage market infrastructure, and also on the regulatory linkages, with the aim that we'll start to see a scaled up carbon market, that a voluntary carbon market that people will be able to sign up to, whether they're corporates, whether they're suppliers, whether NGOs, where we will get to something that people will feel is doing the right thing, that is supporting the transition and is supporting companies moving to net zero and reducing carbon emissions, most importantly, towards the goals of Paris. So that's really where we're coming from, and hopefully it's a positive year next year. We want to work with everybody as much as possible to align what we're doing and to try and reach those goals.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks for giving that feedback. I hope that we can draw on, as Marissa said, we're not building from scratch, right? We can build on everything that's come before. I think the work that Switzerland's doing on these agreements can really inform us going forward on how this works. One thing that we've all mentioned is the importance of enhancing this sort of tracking and accounting infrastructure. And Zubair in the Q&A asked a really good question. Who should be building that? Is that just a central governance structure where we should just appoint one body to do that and they should do it? Or is this a cooperative effort with lots of moving pieces? I'd like just to give that to the panel writ large. Who and how should we be enhancing this transparency and accounting infrastructure that we all think would improve the market? Dirk, I saw you nodding, so I'm going to pick on you.
Well, thanks, Kelly. I mean, I think there are a number of moving pieces, and there's part of me that thinks that maybe a coordination function above it would be helpful. Certainly a lot of leadership that Chris and his colleagues have provided in the TSVCM. You could see it taking on a role like that. But I also think that when it really comes down to the bare bones of transactions and moving at scale and sort of preparing all of these accounting systems, it leads me to think that the notion of a meta registry, which I think a number of the standards have expressed interest in collaborating on, I think could be quite helpful. And Chris's group has done, that's been one of the topics in that task force. The World Bank, we've been working with the World Bank on an advisory group that is exploring this very topic, again, for purposes of kind of bringing it all together. And not that it would necessarily reside in the World Bank, but I think they would like to see it happen. And it may be something that could happen under the sponsorship of private companies and or governments. I'd say watch this space on that particular element that does bring a lot together.
And Veronica, we're continuously talking about this sort of convergence or this interplay between compliance markets and voluntary markets over time. And I think this infrastructure sits right at the heart of that. Like, how would that work between something that was established and run and participated in by the private sector and the necessary role of governments in this sort of international accounting?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, I guess, first of all, I think this sort of infrastructure will need to be set up very soon. That is very clear. There might be different options who might run this infrastructure with pros and cons, but certainly there is one opportunity, of course, for the next climate conference that under the Paris Agreement, there will be such an infrastructure that will be run by governments or the United Nations. Now, this will only cover parts of it, of course, and not necessarily the entire voluntary carbon market, that is very sure. But certainly as soon as the parts that, those parts of the voluntary carbon markets that would include corresponding adjustment will be tracked under that infrastructure as well. So there goes one piece of this infrastructure. Certainly to capture all of the voluntary market or some of the standards or a club, also including potentially governments. This could be done, for example, by the World Bank or by any other sort of club or meta registry. So I guess there's different options out there, and there will be, the challenge will be to define a sensible way forward soon without knowing all the developments that we will see over the next years in this transition period. So I guess that's the biggest challenge, finally, to pick the right place or going parallel for a while and stay, informed on what's going on also on the other ends to make this to work over the next years. So I guess this is an enormous challenge that we see, the development and implementation at the same time. Yeah. But we can only win.
Yeah, we can only win. Marissa, from the perspective of both yourselves with your own net zero commitment and your clients, what do you think would best serve this space without adding confusion, which would actually add clarity?
Yeah, it's a great question. So look, I think, I come back to, again, I think there's so much good work that we can already lean upon. There are some really great registries out there that have done a lot of great work to develop protocols. I think the question, from a quality standpoint will be, to what extent do those protocols need to be reviewed on a regular basis to make sure that, the activities that are being credited are truly additional, and those methodologies reflect the most up-to-date information around regulations, policies, et cetera. I also think there, to the extent that compliance markets continue to develop, there's an important question around how the compliance and the voluntary markets will interact. For example, do the compliance markets want to restrict the extent to which voluntary participants can, purchase offsets recognized in those compliance programs? There are issues like that need to be worked through. And again, I think, the accounting issues around, how you credit reductions to one party in the context of, something that also counts as a reduction for an NDC. Again, I don't see these as insurmountable. They're just things that have to be worked through. And I think there are different approaches and solutions. So I'm optimistic. And again, I come back to, offsets play a critical role as a cost containment mechanism in helping to facilitate reductions from activities and sectors that otherwise would be, difficult, if not impossible, to regulate directly. So I think, in my view, as long as we continue to recognize the importance that offsets play in either a compliance or a voluntary market, that's number one. And then let's sort through, what are the issues that we need to make sure we need to address so that the reductions that do take place are of highest quality.
Thank you. And I think that's a great note to end our panel discussion on, because I think you've hit on the optimism, the importance of offsets, and the quality. all of those I really think are the key things that we want to leave you with. The recommendations will be published tomorrow. As I said, this is a first step. We've highlighted questions here that need further work. The Q&A has brought up questions that need further work. We obviously need to get our skates on, but we're not starting from scratch. We can build upon what's there. And I just really want to thank the facilitation team and the panelists and for all the participants for joining today. Have a great Monday. Sorry for doing this to you on a Monday, but have a great Monday, and thank you guys so much for this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all.